30 years ago. We don't do a lot of these kinds of things that you guys are doing. We do have a journal with some pretty good publications, Banisteria, but we have, trouble keeping members. I think the membership's been declining over the years, but we're still in existence, the Virginia Natural History Society. So anyway, my journey with tiger beetles started in the mid-70s when I was teaching at a small college, looking for an insect that I could engage students with because of, interesting behavior, etc. And the conservation aspect with tiger beetles started in the mid-80s when I proposed a $5,000 grant to investigate the status of the Puritan and northeastern beach tiger beetles, two species that occur in Maryland, northeastern beach also in Virginia. I had a sense that they were pretty rare. And so that report, 1985, eventually resulted in these two species being listed as federally threatened. They both have pretty interesting distributions. The mother lode of both is in the Chesapeake Bay, but both of them also have populations in the Northeast, in Massachusetts and Connecticut, surprisingly. And nobody's ever actually figured out the geologic history that accounts for that. But I'll say a little bit more of that as we go along. Next slide. So tiger beetles are not the most diverse group in the US or worldwide. 211 subspecies. That will, the fact that there's a lot of subspecies tell you, kind of like birds, they're a popular group. A lot of people like to identify these differences, and they are legitimate subspecies. Most of these are in the West because of the geologic diversity, the variation in habitats that we find associated with elevational differences. New Mexico, I just finished a book 2 years ago on the tiger beetles in New Mexico that has 65 subspecies. There are 22 species in Maryland, no subspecies identified. So it's pretty typical for the eastern states, which have relatively few compared to the western states. Next slide. This is a popular group with naturalists, insect collectors, and increasingly with nature photographers. Part of their popularity is the diversity. As you see here, the colors, they're charismatic invertebrates. They're pretty, not quite like butterflies, but I think they're a close second in terms of their popularity. And a lot of variation in the markings and color. And virtually all species, next slide, virtually all species in the US can be identified by color and marking with some knowledge of distribution. I was one of the co-authors of the Tiger Beetles of the US and Canada, which has this figure is actually from that book. But anyway, it's obviously popular if folks can identify what they're seeing. And that's one of the things that we have with tiger beetles, aside from their natural beauty. Next slide. I think that one of the things that attracted me to tiger beetles is that they are pretty interesting. I always like predators and compared to plant feeders. These guys are visually hunting active predators that move quickly to run after and grab anything that's moving on the ground about their size or smaller. And they use their mandibles to catch and macerate them. And so that's their predatory behavior. Now, many of them will also scavenge. We found them feeding on dead fish, crabs, and other dead organisms on the beaches and so forth. So they are kind of limited by food availability, but so they're kind of opportunistic predators. Next slide. They share a lot with lizards in that they are behavioral thermoregulators. They bask in the sun, move to hot spots to get their body temperature up to practically the temperature of warm-blooded vertebrates. And they need that high temperature to be able to capture prey. And when the ground surface temperature is hot, things get warm, they will exhibit cooling behaviors, stilting, raising their body up off the ground, sun facing, and in some cases, they'll retreat to shade, or even some of the species in the sandy habitats will actually dig burrows during the hot part of the day. So they are able to, as long as it's sunny or moderately warm, they can maintain a pretty high level of activity much of the day. But anyway, this is very similar to the behavior we see with lizards in the thermoregulatory behaviors. Next slide. So the larvae are entirely different. They are also predators, but they are sedentary, sit and wait burrow dwellers. The female will deposit an egg an inch into the ground. That egg will hatch into a grub-like larva, and that larva will dig a burrow, depending on the species, ranging from a couple inches to a foot or more, and they will go through 3 larval stages prior to pupating and then emerging as an adult. And in most species, that 3-stage development takes 2 years. The larvae will spend their life with the head and pronotum blocking the burrow mouth, just waiting for an ant or another insect to come on by. They're totally dependent on things coming within about an inch of the burrow. And of course, they obviously have very acute ability to detect movement and vibrations, and they will lurch out, typically with a backstroke, and grab that prey and pull it down into the burrows and feed on it. That strike behavior is so fast that it's hard to see. But that's what the larvae do. They will spend their life waiting at the burrow mouth for prey to pass nearby. And so obviously they're dependent on the amount of prey. Now, some species will relocate their burrows, particularly the water edge species, like one that we'll talk about, with changing water levels like we see in the Chesapeake Bay and river edges and so forth. If there's some inundation, they will move out of their burrows and relocate their burrows back further on the beach. But many species in other habitats like grasslands and dunes and so forth will typically remain in this same burrow, enlarging it as they develop and emerging as an adult from that burrow. Next slide. I have been involved quite a bit in getting tiger beetles recognized as important conservation species. And some of the advantages of tiger beetles is that they are pretty, people like them, and there are some habitat generalists that occur in a lot of different habitats, but many of them are very specific to a sand dune, a coastal dune habitat, possibly a mountain grassland. So they are, excuse me, critical indicators of different habitat types. They have also been used to indicate biodiversity because they're pretty easy to sample, to see, and count and observe. Their numbers have been related to biodiversity in tropical areas in particular. Easier to sample than birds and some other biodiversity indicators. So they have that advantage well. But of course, insects are low priority items, as I can attest because of the amount of funding that is available for doing insect research. But notwithstanding, I've been able to, Maryland DNR, for example, has funded my surveys for the two beetles we'll hear about for 30 years. So we have an amazing history of population surveys for these two species. But anyway, next slide. We will see that insects, relative to their numbers, the endangered, this is a little bit of a dated slide here. There's somewhat more than that now, but just a small number that are actually listed as endangered or threatened. But tiger beetles, all being in one family, are pretty well represented. I've done most of the work for 4 of the 5 of these. And again, it all started with the 2 that we're going to talk about tonight, that are in Maryland. Next slide. So here are some of the listed and candidate species from kind of clockwise: the Puritan tiger beetle. The green one is the Ohlone tiger beetle that is restricted to grasslands, coastal grasslands in Santa Cruz, California. The next one is the coral pink sand dunes that I studied for 25 years, restricted to one population at the coral pink sand dunes in southern Utah, about 30 miles south of Zion. It's a candidate for listing. And then in the lower right is a new one that has been listed as a result of petitioning. This is the Miami tiger beetle, found only in 2 locations in Miami-Dade County in an interesting habitat, pine rocklands. And then the middle one is the Salt Creek tiger beetle, restricted to inland salt marshes near Lincoln, Nebraska. And the one on the lower left is one that I studied in Florida, in the Lake Wales Ridge. This is a Highlands tiger beetle. Studies found that it was pretty well established and did not merit listing. It was a candidate at one point. So anyway, there are quite a few others that are under consideration for listing, and I'm doing some work currently with 2 petitions to list 2 additional species of tiger beetles. One in actually both in one in California and one in Arizona. Next slide. Okay, so the Puritan tiger beetle, by the way, the genus of both of these species went from Cicindela to some revisions, so they have different genera presently, but for simplified purposes, I keep the old name, Cicindela puritana. So this is a species that is found along narrow beaches that are backed by vertical cliffs within the Chesapeake Bay of Maryland. The larvae, the adults, spend their time along these narrow beaches feeding, mating, and they will then move up onto these cliff faces where they lay their egg and where the larva develops during a 2-year developmental period. Next slide. So we have two major locations for this species. There are 9 populations, some pretty small, in Calvert County, including Calvert Cliff State Park, and they're all similar type of habitat. And the other metapopulation also consists of 9 populations at the mouth of the Sassafras River. Interestingly, this metapopulation was first discovered by one of my former students at Randolph-Macon, who's actually a Maryland resident. He was working on SAVs in the mouth of the Sassafras and brought in this tiger beetle, showed me, and I said, "Where'd you get that?" He said, "Up around the Sassafras." I said, "No way." Well, it turns out that it was the Puritan tiger beetle, and surveys in the early 90s found these additional populations there. Now, more recently, there have been 2 very small populations found along the Severn River. One of those has already winked out because of shoreline structures being placed. The other is just a handful of individuals. So both of those are at pretty significant risk for surviving. But again, these are narrow beaches, sandy beaches backed by cliffs, the habitat of this species. Next slide. So the cliffs are somewhat variable in the nature, the particle size, and the type of soil. This is an Eastern Shore Sassafras River site that is pretty sandy substrate, and the larvae only use the sandy substrates. Next slide. In Calvert County, we have quite a variation. Many of you have probably been to Calvert County and the Fossil Cliffs and so forth, and there's a lot of different strata there, and many of them are not suitable for tiger beetles. Next slide. The hard, compact clay, the marl are not suitable. So the female seeks out the sandy layers, and that's where the larvae of the Puritan tiger beetle develop. There is another species, a very common tiger beetle, the bronze tiger beetle, that co-occurs with Puritana, and it is able to utilize these other substrates. Next slide. So this is kind of what the larval burrows look like. This is a nice, healthy population. These are mostly third instars. The smaller ones are probably the second stage. But again, they spend their life in these vertical cliffs. The burrows are like 10 to 12 inches deep. And again, they're depending on things to come by their burrow mouth and grab the prey and take 2 years to develop. But again, like many tiger beetles, it's the female that selects the oviposition spot. And that's a lot of times based on the type of soil. Next slide. So the status of the 2 Maryland metapopulations. You see here, this is the sum of the 9 separate populations. And the numbers fluctuate greatly depending on primarily erosional events, to some extent rainfall. They don't seem to be affected by parasites, but it seems like the nature of the cliff and how much recruitment there is seems to be the determining factor. But numbers fluctuate, and so during the early 2000s, we had a major decline. Next slide. And that major decline was also seen in the Sassafras River populations, which in total are much smaller. But again, the fate is still undecided of this species in Maryland. Numbers are up and down. We definitely have challenges. We're definitely losing sites. Next slide. And as you may know, certainly in the popular media, we have this conflict between houses on the top of the cliffs in Calvert County, trying to prevent erosion and protect their houses. But unfortunately, the natural erosional events without shoreline stabilization are beneficial for the Puritan tiger beetles. This is an example here of a revetment riprap that was approved and put in place in tiger beetle habitat. And within a few years, what we see is what typically happens when the shoreline is stabilized. Rapid vegetation, colonization, both native and invasive, and this eliminates tiger beetle habitat. All tiger beetles, in fact, need open, bare areas for the adults to forage, catch their prey, for oviposition sites, and for the larvae to develop. And so universally, many of these species that are being impacted and threatened are the impact is from increasing vegetation in their habitat and the elimination of the natural bare openings that have been maintained historically by fires, floods, and other natural events. So this is the challenge at the Maryland sites. Now there are still sites like at Calvert Cliffs where there are no shoreline structures. Erosion continues. We get these periodic breakdowns that, as a matter of fact, can eliminate significant numbers of larvae that can be washed out into the bay. But the eventual effect is that these bare cliffs create habitat for recruitment of new individuals. Next slide. The second species is the northeastern beach tiger beetle. The one within the Chesapeake Bay is the subspecies Cicindela, the different Hybroscylomorpha, dorsalis dorsalis. There are 4 subspecies of this species. Within the Chesapeake Bay, we have Dorsalis dorsalis, and at Assateague, this is the only site in Maryland, we have Dorsalis media, the other subspecies, and that occurs along the Virginia Barrier Islands and south along the Carolinas, Georgia, and into Florida. A much greater range for this other subspecies, and it is not currently listed in any way. So anyway, interesting distribution of Dorsalis dorsalis. The mother lode is in Virginia with several populations in Maryland, and the disjunct part of the distribution consists of 2 populations in Massachusetts. One at Martha's Vineyard, a single population, and a second population that we established by translocation at Monomoy National Wildlife Refuge. These are both Dorsalis dorsalis. There is some genetic difference, but at present, they are considered the same subspecies. So the populations in the Northeast and Massachusetts are obviously much more at risk. This species once occurred from Virginia along practically every beach in New Jersey, Long Island, excuse me, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Massachusetts. They have all been wiped out by recreational beach activity. So we only have these two populations in the Northeast. And again, the mother lode consists of about 50 populations in Virginia, many of them very small, and 3 populations in Maryland. Next slide. So in Virginia, you can't really see the dots, but we had about 100 populations in the 1990s and about 80,000 individuals. And now we are down to about 50 populations, many of them small, and a total of about 20,000 individuals. Dramatic decline here. Similar situation in Maryland, where we had 4 pretty decent, robust populations in Calvert County and 2 in the Eastern Shore at Janes and Cedar Island. Next slide. So what has happened, the causes of the decline are natural shoreline changes. These are dynamic habitats, the bay as well as the ocean. They're constantly changing with erosion and accretion. There's also sea level rise, impacts, more substantial impacts from hurricanes and storms, nor'easters, etc. And the big problem in Virginia, where most of the populations are, to a lesser extent in Maryland, is the armoring of shorelines with groins, revetments, bulkheads. There is probably close to half of the shoreline in Virginia has become armored, including many tiger beetle habitats. There's also an impact of vehicles and heavy-duty foot traffic, which is really what wiped them out of the Northeast. And fortunately, in Virginia, most of the sites in the Chesapeake Bay are private ownership. They're not public beaches. So that's the reason that the species has done fairly well there over the years, except for the recent armoring, people protecting their houses and so forth. Next slide. So this is the story of Calvert County populations of the northeastern beach tiger beetle. When I first started in the late 80s into the early 90s, we had 4 really large populations. Flag Ponds had about 3,000 beetles. Sinus Cliffs had several hundred. Cove Point had 500 to 600, and Western Shores had a couple thousand. 3 of those sites are now gone, and we are left with from 2000 on, about 2007, 2006 on, those low numbers there represent the one Western Shores population. This is, if you don't know where Western Shores is, it's just north of Calvert Beach, Matoaka Cottages. This is actually an interesting site that has both puritana and further north, where it's no cliffs and only beach, we have the northeastern beach tiger beetle. And so those numbers have fluctuated from around 500 to a little over 1,000 in the last 15 years. That's our only population. Next slide. So what happened? This is the kind of beach that dorsalis likes, preferably 3 to 6 meters wide above the high tide. They lay their eggs on the back beach. The larvae take 2 years to develop. So when the beach is narrow, 2 to 3 meters, they're totally inundated, subject to winter storms, and they cannot survive through the 2 years of their life cycle. And this is what we have seen a lot in Virginia, the narrowing of the beaches. They're going away, clearly, and also to some extent in Maryland. Next slide. So this is what happened. Several things happened at Flag Pond. There's been this red line indicates the 1990 shoreline, and most of the beetles, 2,000 or so, were in the upper portion of this red line, where it was a much wider beach. And over the years, that area has eroded and the sand has moved south. And that, coupled with the increased popularity of flag ponds as a go-to designation for bathers and beach lovers, we lost that population. But the decline was also apparent early on with the natural shoreline change. There's another slide later. It's sort of out of place. That'll show this a little bit more clearly. Next slide. So, you know, from the wide beach that we saw in the earlier slide, we're seeing this in many of the Virginia and some of the Maryland beaches where erosion is cutting back the wide sandy beaches that are needed are disappearing. And this also has an impact on the Puritan tiger beetle. They can actually move and forage on the cliff faces, and they can deal with narrow beaches much more than dorsalis can because their larvae are in the cliffs. So they're somewhat immune from the narrowing of the beaches. And this is why, one of the reasons why Puritana is doing a bit better than dorsalis, the northeastern beach tiger beetle, because their larvae are in the cliffs and somewhat immune from the recession of beaches. Next slide. This is the major enemy, you know, the revetments, the riprap, the groins. Whenever we find this kind of situation, there's likely to be a narrowing of the beach and reduced area for the development of the larvae over, you know, the 2 years that they have. Next slide. So this is the other picture of flag ponds. In the 1990s and the late 80s, this red line, this is where we had a nice wide beach, very little human activity, and 2,000 beetles in this section and lots of larvae. Then and again, a lot of this is natural shoreline dynamics. We ended up with what we see in 2009, where that yellow arrow that was once primo habitat is now so narrow that there's just no habitat. You know, it's 1 to 2 meters wide. The waves and the beach is eliminated at high tide. So that's the situation there. Next slide. Yeah, living shorelines, talk a little bit about that as well. Okay, so here is a classic example documenting sea level rise in Virginia. This is within the Chesapeake Bay. This is in Southern Virginia, in a bay area. We had this small, narrow island, Deep Hole Point, that had consistently 500 or more beetles in the 1990s into the early 2000s. By 2014, this was all that was left. And I don't have the current slide, but it's totally inundated. Sea level rise has totally eliminated this habitat. Not quite as dramatic, but similar situation is the recession of beaches and the loss of these shoreline habitats, the narrowing of the many beaches that used to support good populations. Next slide. So again, these revetments, riprap, whenever the revetments in riprap are really the worst sort of shoreline structure for the northeastern beach tiger beetle. They will certainly protect the houses behind them, at least in the short term, but universally, if you put in a revetment or riprap like this, the beach is going to disappear within a few years. Totally non-habitat. Some of the other structures, breakwaters and groins, can sustain a population, maybe for a longer period, but the riprap, the revetments are just total devastation of the population. Next slide. Okay, so I've left time for questions, and hopefully there are some, but be happy to do what I can. There was a question about living shorelines that I did see pop up. There's some question about, living shorelines have been proposed, and to some extent, a lot of times these living shorelines involve vegetation, which can actually eliminate habitat. There's also breakwaters, which are kind of like a offshore revetment, along with nourishment. So there's some habitat behind those breakwaters. And my geologic colleague and I have just completed a big study of shoreline structures in Virginia. And we have concluded that breakwaters with nourishment behind them are the best solution for sustaining habitat, because they reduce erosion, they have sand, but the unfortunate thing is that based on our studies of the progression of erosion, sea level rise, is that in another 20 to 30 years, nothing is going to seem to protect these beaches. So it's a dismal scenario for the northeastern beach tiger beetle.
All right, Barry, thank you so much. We're gonna thank you for opening up the questions. I put a spotlight on you. If you would like to ask Barry a question, you can put it in the chat box or raise your hand, and I'll call on you, and you can unmute and ask it directly. We do have several questions or comments in the chat box already. Rick pointed out that there are 27 Maryland Biodiversity Project lists 27 species in Maryland, but some have caveats.
Okay. Yeah, there are 4 or 5 others that are on the Maryland list of rare species, the swap list. And there's at least one of them had been extirpated, the big sand tiger beetle. So yeah, I've been a little bit involved with that, but yeah, the total count could be a bit higher.
And let's see, Richard says that he sees many bright green unmarked tiger beetles along wooded Susquehanna foot trails in Harford County. They always land on sunny spots. Where are they living, developing, overwintering?
So it's likely that is the six-spotted tiger beetle. The marks are sometimes reduced, but they typically are spring active into June, sometimes July, if it's the species I'm thinking about. There aren't too many green ones in Maryland. But the eggs are laid along the forest trails and in open areas, and they take 2 years to develop as larvae in that situation. And the adults are typically using the sunny spots in the forest breaks or along the sunny spots in the trail, particularly when the trees leave out. So I'm assuming that is the six-spotted tiger beetle, the one that most people see actually.
So all tiger beetles have a 2-year larval period?
Not exactly. In some areas in the West, they take 3 and 4 years. A lot of it's sort of evolutionarily, but in Maryland, most species take 2 years. Now, there is one very common one on sandy beaches called the hairy-necked tiger beetle that occurs with dorsalis at many sites, plus it occurs at many other sites. Those adults come out in March and April. They lay their eggs on the sandy beaches. Their larvae go through development fairly rapidly, and they come out as new adults in August and September. They are sexually immature. They do a lot of feeding, and then they go to the back beach and dig in, spend the winter, several, probably 5, 7, 8, 9 inches into the sand. They pop out again in the spring. When they're sexually mature, they mate and lay their eggs. So that's a 1-year life cycle.
Karen asks, I think you mentioned before that there was a reintroduction or an introduction to sites that might have suitable habitat. Can you elaborate on that?
The translocation?
Yes.
Yeah. So one of the big challenges of this species is to establish new populations in the Northeast, where we only had that one, and all the others are gone. And there were very few places that were not subject to human disturbance. So we took larvae from my colleagues, larvae from the Martha's Vineyard population, 15 or 20 larvae over a period of 3 years, put them in the ground at Monomoy National Wildlife Refuge, which is north of Cape Cod or just offshore from Cape Cod. And after a slow start, that population exploded to 3,000 and 4,000 beetles. So it is the second viable population in the Northeast, established by translocation. So we'd like to do that at more sites in the Northeast, but there's almost no suitable sites acceptable, that are not humanly impacted. But it's amazing example of the resilience of these beetles they're a colonizing species. So historically, in Maryland, I've picked them up 20 miles away, well, at least 10 miles away. So they're dispersers, they're recolonizers, if there is good habitat, which is the problem.
Has there been any information on, is the fact that their burrows seem so long into the side of the cliff, does that help protect them from any sloughing of the sides of the cliffs?
Yeah, it does. Certainly, the deeper the burrows, and the same thing with the northeastern beach tiger beetle. It's about 12 to 14 inches deep, so it can withstand a certain amount of erosion and winter storm activity. I have also done a bunch of studies where I took larvae, including the northeastern beach tiger beetle, put them in a vial of water, totally inundated, and they were able to survive 3 to 4 days, uh, totally inundated. So, and then some additional studies with other speedles. The upshot is that they can take inundation probably even longer by trapping air in their burrows underground. Uh, so yeah, they are adapted to inundation, not only northeastern beach, but other beetles, other water edge tiger beetles as well.
Jean has says that there were on Hart Miller Island, where we're going on our boat and bus tour. There's been 5 tiger beetle species identified: bronze, hairy-necked, punctured, six-spotted, and eastern beach, which is extirpated now.
Yeah, that's an interesting example of their colonizing ability. I've never been there. I've heard about it, and sorry, I never got there in my travels. But yeah, that is uh, a perfect example of the resilience and colonizing ability of tiger beetles. If there is habitat, they will come. But what happened during the extirpation from all these sites in the Northeast, Long Island, New Jersey, etc., they started wiping out populations, slowly from 1900 to the 1920s to the 40s, so that the distances between existing populations were too great, so that when a population winked out, there couldn't be any recolonization. So it was kind of a domino effect of extinction, in part because of the lack of recolonization uh, with increasingly few sites that were suitable.
Kay asks if she was the find one and picked it up. How are they? Will they try to bite you?
Yeah, they can give you a little pinch if they get you between the fingers and the soft skin area. Some of the bigger ones, there's some that are almost an inch big. They can inflict, maybe even draw blood. But if people don't know tiger beetles, when you get in with 20 or 30, within 20 or 30 feet, they're going to fly up and away. They're very elusive, very wary. Uh, so to catch them, you have to creep incredibly slowly with your net ready and then slap it down. They're a challenge. This is part of my fun in working with tiger beetles. They're take some athleticism and talent to catch them. But yeah, you're not you can actually get within a foot or two, as many photographers know, if you move slow enough. But that's the challenge. But even moving slowly, they will fly up when you get close.
Kay also asks, is there a reason, do we understand why they spend so much time in the larval form? She's more used to Lepidoptera.
Yes, it's strictly food availability. Uh, uh, I've reared them, and you can push them through very rapidly if you provide extra food. But they don't burn a lot of. They don't. I mean, they do expend energy digging the burrows, and after a rain, cleaning out the burrows. But basically, uh, they are at the mercy of things that come to the burrow, which are ants, and they're in relatively food limited situation because of their lifestyle in burrows, depending on things to come by. So uh, they don't get a lot of meals, and so that's really. I mean, there is some genetic regulation of their life cycles uh, related to photoperiod and things like that. But basically, most of them are 2 years. And if they don't, if the eggs are laid late, they don't get a lot of food, they will go a whole nother year, 3 years. So it's food availability that is the determinant.
Well, what if they eat ants is larva? What do they eat as adults?
The adults are active predators. It's amazing in all my years of studying tiger beetles. You know, you'll see adults run around and they'll look like they're grabbing something. Uh, they will take any kind of arthropod or organism that is smaller than them. They'll respond to movement and they'll run and grab. So they're able to get a lot more food than the larvae. Uh, but of course, they expend a lot of energy as well. But again, as I mentioned, they will scavenge. Uh, and they're also feeding on small things like springtails, little tiny, practically microscopic things that you see them run and grab. You don't see any prey. Chances are it's something really small. But anyway, they will feed on practically any small arthropod that they can catch. Ants, of course, are ubiquitous and the most common prey in their habitats. But ants also have nasty chemical defenses. So you'll very often see a tiger beetle run and grab an ant. The ant will get away, it'll run and grab it again, uh, and it may or may not macerate it. So, you know, ants are pretty well defended, but they do. It is one of the major food sources. Small flies, gnats. Uh, so anything they can catch, but they have excellent vision and rapid movement to pounce on prey.
A couple of people have asked how long do they live as an adult?
Yeah, the typical length of adult activity for most species is about 2 months. But individual adults, any individual adult will probably live anywhere from 3 weeks to 6 weeks. But you know, there's some continual emergence. They don't all emerge at the same time. Uh, but uh, but yeah, the average lifespan is probably about a month and a half. That's about the maximum that any individual will live. And for the whole population, uh, we have two life cycle types in tiger beetles. I talked about the one that has a 1 year life cycle. That's called a spring fall life cycle. They come out in early spring, lay their eggs, die off, and then another cohort from the previous year comes out in the fall. And then there's the summer form that come out in June, and they start dying off in mid-August, like dorsalis and puritana. Uh, they're pretty much gone by the end of August.
Joe wants to know, are there any thoughts about raising the beetles in the labs to save the genotype?
Yes, they are capable of being reared, uh, and the difficulty is getting them through different generations because there are some photoperiod and other things that make them difficult to raise continual generations. But there are a couple zoos that are working on that. And right now I'm working with the people at the Miami Zoo, where we have the Miami Tiger Beetle. And we've actually proposed to try and develop a laboratory colony uh, of the Miami Tiger Beetle. But that has not been done yet, but it's certainly possible uh, to do.
Along those lines, well, not on those lines, but Josh is curious to learn more about how you do the counts and the population estimates.
Good question. I'm currently working on a study to document all the tiger beetle records in the northeastern states. And part of that study is to write a paper on survey methods. So the main survey method that has been used for Puritana and dorsalis are visual index counts. These are tiger beetles that are in most tiger beetles are in open habitats. They're along the shoreline. So what I have done for 20 to 30 years is to walk slowly along the beaches, both dorsalis beaches and Puritana beaches in Virginia and Maryland, looking 20 to 30 feet up ahead, walking right at the water edge, looking 20 to 30 feet ahead, and counting all the beetles that I see. If you move slowly, the beetles will retreat to the back beach, and you can avoid double counting. And so that's the method that we have used. The same time every year during peak abundance, when the beetles are active on sunny days, sunny warm days. And the same for other species. Visually observing and counting beetles with 2 or 3 workers, systematically covering the habitat. We have also used mark and recapture. Some species you can catch with pitfall traps. But part of the advantage of tiger beetles as a conservation species is that they're not hiding, they're not secretive, they're out and visible and can be counted under the right conditions fairly accurately.
But you're only counting the adults. Are you not going out and counting holes for larvae?
We have done both, yeah. Mostly it's been adults, but if we're trying to figure out if something is a habitat, the larvae are the best indicator of habitat. And so we do a same kind of visual survey. Sometimes we use transects, but instead of looking 20 to 30 feet ahead, we're looking right at our feet to find those larval burrows. And there is specific characteristics to tell tiger beetle larval burrows from the many other holes. I didn't get into that, but that can be done with some experience, recognizing larval burrows of tiger beetles.
Richard asks about habitats. Is it only saltwater beaches, freshwater beaches, or both with different species?
Dorsalis is actually on ocean beaches. The southern subspecies are in ocean beaches, but it's likely that dorsalis, which we have in the bay, and also, of course, up in the ocean beaches in Massachusetts, has a wide range of salinity tolerance. So that's not an issue. There are some species that are restricted to salt flats, and studies have found that the females only lay eggs in saline habitats, but that is not the case. Again, there are some coastal species that are restricted to saline habitats, but not Puritana and dorsalis. So that's part of the habitat specificity. There are strictly coastal saline forms, salt flat species in the western states, playas, sand dune species. They even occur above timberline in some of the mountain meadows. So this habitat specificity seems to depend more on other habitat parameters, vegetation, elevation, and soil particle size rather than salinity. But salinity is a factor in some species. The female has the ability to seek out the ideal spot for her offspring.
So we do take lots of trips down to the cliffs areas to do fossil hunting. Should we have our folks on the lookout for this information? Is there any information that you would find useful done by fossil hunters?
There's two other species that might be found on the Calvert beaches. Remind me if I forget, but I'll send you photos of those. The hairy-necked and the bronzed tiger beetle also will co-occur with Puritana. Dorsalis is pretty easy to recognize because of its white color. The only place in Calvert you'll see that is if you go to Matoaka Cottage, where you got to pay to $5 to walk the beach, to park your car, if you know where that is, near Calvert Beach, and walk beyond the cliffs about a mile north. That's where the dorsalis population, where the cliffs disappear and where the open beach begins. You will see dorsalis anywhere from late June till the latter part of, to at least mid-August. And on the way, at the base of the cliffs, by the way, you got to go at low tide because it's eroding so badly that you still may have to walk knee deep in water to get through the cliff part. But there will be Puritana on the way. So that's the only site that has both species. Calvert Cliff State Park, most of the dorsalis, most of the Puritana habitat at Calvert Cliffs is roped off because of cliff breakdown. If you've been there, you'll see the signs. I've had permission to take my life in hands and walk the breakdown areas to count the beetles where most of them are. But I'll send some information to you and for folks that want to go there, how to find them. But both species are from the end of June till early July, early August is prime time.
Do we have any other questions from the peanut gallery up there? Raise your hand and I can call on you to unmute and talk directly. Anybody? Those behaviors that you talked about early on, the thermoregulation, is that unique to tiger beetles or are they found in other insect orders or other families?
There's a handful of other insects like grasshoppers and dragonflies. It's not very common, so it is pretty limited, but it does occur in a few other insects, yeah. But I think tiger beetles are kind of the masters of that. Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions? Anybody want to say hi?
Send me an email if you want information on tiger beetles. But yeah, I'm always happy to talk. Glad you guys are doing so much stuff with the Natural History Society. So,
oh, Rick says that for the thermoregulation, you said they raised their temperature to 40 Fahrenheit, but did you mean 40 centigrade?
Yes, absolutely, yeah. I did some early studies. We do this grab and stab things where you watch a tiger beetle, its behavior, quickly net it, and stick a small micro probe into the thorax to get the temperature. Yeah, and it's about the temperature of humans' body temperature, 98 Fahrenheit, 38 to 40 centigrade. Yeah, sorry about that. Good you corrected that. But yeah, they can hold that temperature for quite a bit of the day.
Charlie, did you want to say something?
Just a greeting, Barry. This is Charlie Davis that helped you with the coral pink sand dunes research.
Yeah, Charlie,
97.
yeah, when I heard about this meeting, you're the name that popped into my head because I know you're up there and you're into this sort of thing. Yeah, Charlie uh, helped with the coral pink sand dunes tiger beetles in the 1990s. Came out for 1 year and did some good stuff on plant uh, colonization that we never published, like a lot of stuff, but it was great. I still have that information. My goal is still to get some of this stuff published. If I got a few years left in me and a lot of unpublished stuff like that study, and maybe it'll get done. But it's still in the report form.
All right, well, contact me, and I certainly would help in any of that.
Will do, Charlie.
Yeah.
Good hearing from you.
Yep.
Do you have a favorite tiger beetle, Barry?
I've got quite a few. I probably got to say that that coral pink sand dune ones that I invested a lot of my life with is one of the favorites. Yeah, I've got a top five, but I spent so much of my time in the West because there's so many more species out there and they're so interesting. Uh, and so I have, several Western species that they're at the top of my list. So yeah.
And it's
All
behind
right.
you on the wall. It's behind you on your wall behind you.
Yep, that one there with the brown frame, that's the coral pink sand dunes tiger beetle that is still hanging on. One population in the world fluctuated from 500 to 3,000, but it's still surviving, still doing okay.
Ron, when
Well, this is
I'll say one thing to help promote Barry's work. Those of you that are interested in tiger beetles, you need to get the book, A Field Guide to Tiger Beetles of the Eastern, I can't read it backwards, of the United States and Canada.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a little pricey right now because I think it's out of print, unfortunately. I don't know if we have a third edition in us, but it's available in secondhand outlets. But yeah, unfortunately, it's pretty pricey. I have a couple copies of the earlier edition, but yeah, it's too bad. I've envisioned writing or actually producing a book of tiger beetles, a photo guide, and it's on my list. So it would be kind of like the field guide, but a photo guide, an abbreviated version. So, but yeah, enjoyed it all.
great. Well, thank you so much, and thank you for all the work that you've done and helping us understand this amazing piece of our natural history. And so kudos to you and for sharing that knowledge with us. And I know that everybody on here is going to be out as it gets a little bit warmer and the tiger beetles emerge, and we're going to have our eyes open and start looking around for some of these. It'll be
Sounds good. They're out already, warm days. So thank you all. Enjoyed it. Just again, if you have stuff you want to know, just email me. I'm always glad to help. Take care.
Thank you so much, everybody. And next week it's cow nose rays in the Chesapeake Bay. So we'll see you again on Must Learn Thursday. Everybody stay well, stay curious, stay outside. Bye-bye.
Take care.
Thanks so much. That was great.